Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Gilded Age Industrialism, Growth of Scale and Scope. Look at the map behind this slide. You'll see the red lines, the intensity of the red lines in this 1890 map of railroads, heavily concentrated in an area from basically Iowa and Minnesota eastward to New York and the New England states. This is the Rust Belt, what came to be called the Rust Belt. It is the Northeast and Midwest, and it is the highest area of industrialization in the Gilded Age. Look at the South. You'll see a fair number of railroads, but not all that many. And then if you look west beyond Kansas, you'll see the West has very few railroads. We've already talked about the New South and the New West. So now we're going to talk about what's going on in this area, this industrialized area of the Northeast and Midwest, again that later became known as the Rust Belt. Industrialization grew over the course of the 19th century from a local to a regional set of interests, and then it gained national reach during the Gilded Age. This came about because of an expansion in transportation. Of course, it came about in an expansion of manufacturing. It came about because of an expansion of distribution networks, and it came about because of a growth, a huge growth, in a financial sector that had barely existed prior to the Civil War. Industrialization required overall mobilized capital, but it also required managerial and organizational expertise, what economic historian Alfred Chandler called the visible hand of market capitalism. Industrialization required laws favoring business expansion, and it aimed for economies of scale. Furthermore, it needed centralized, available pools of labor, and overall, it required peace and social stability. Industrialization occurred within the context of big business. The national transportation system was realized through railroads, and large manufacturing corporations, this big business of industrialization, took their organizational lead from the model created by railroads that began in the antebellum era. These giant businesses, quote unquote, abruptly entered business structure of the United States after 1885. And we see in manufacturing the rise of factories. In early years, the antebellum period, the period in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, before the growth of giant manufacturing centers and factories, in these early years, factories and manufacturing businesses were much smaller. Even in mass production industries like cordwaining and textile milling, these industries' workers were merely machine operatives, but these businesses employed small numbers of people. They had few managers, and there was a great amount of personal contact between the owners and the workers. One of the things that railroads did was to demonstrate that ownership and management had to be broken apart in giant concerns that required large amounts of capital. Much more capital than a single owner or a small group of owners could provide. When you went out onto the capital market, you got silent partners, and these silent partners did not manage the company. In contrast, the most famous manufacturer in the Gilded Age was Andrew Carnegie, and he talked of knowing only 14 people in his organization, even though he employed tens of thousands of workers. Now, these new factories, the sites of mass production, became the leading edge of manufacturing during the Gilded Age, and the United States became a leader in heavy industrial manufacturing throughout the world during the Gilded Age. This is not only to say that smaller enterprises and even small factories ceased to exist, but they were no longer the leading edge of the manufacturing sector. We still see sweatshops in the garment industries like those of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company that experienced a fire in 1910 that led directly to factory regulation that many people curse as OSHA today. We'll deal with this particular tragedy at a later time. In this era, we still see cottage industry too, but it's different than earlier types of cottage industry. This occurs in very light manufacturing of consumer goods such as cigars, with families working in their tenement by piecework. What truly faded away with the rise of the factory were the craft workshops of the antebellum era, where highly skilled journeymen who were on their way to becoming master craftsmen and owners controlled the workflow, and they made pieces to order rather than making for a mass market in what was called on spec. With the introduction of factories, manufacturing changed dramatically. Factories became behemoths that overwhelmed the people who worked in them, and they followed a single organizational model after a while that featured specialized machinery, central sources of mechanical or electrical power that ran all of the machinery, large numbers of employees working at the pace of the machinery, and a complex division of labor. Big business itself organized differently than before it had during the Civil War, becoming more centralized in an effort to stabilize markets, control competition, and create high barriers to new entrants to those markets. If what you hear sounds like these businessmen didn't know what they were doing, that's because they were making it up as they went along. They were inventing the system that we think of today as commonplace. Laws did not recognize the mechanisms of business conglomeration that we take for granted today. So let's look back at a history of business unification in an effort to control markets, to raise barriers to entry from competitors, and to actually stifle competition. Railroad corporations had tried to use pools but had failed. Manufacturing corporations had tried cartels, but Congress refused to legalize these. So some industries got the idea to use trusts. Trusts were introduced by John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil in 1882, and this method of organizing and controlling competition spread like wildfire. A trust is a legal relationship, and you've heard of these. It's usually a banker or a lawyer acting as an agent for a person, in which that banker or lawyer, called a trustee, administers that person's assets, like a trust fund. Competing corporations in these trusts put all of their stock in the hands of a board of trustees, though that was the assets of the corporation. They received trust certificates in return, and this board of trustees became a board of directors of what had become a centralized corporation, managed more or less as a single unit. Nevertheless, in trusts, lines of authority and succession were weak, so the resulting business was not really a corporation, but rather a confederation of companies, run in part by people with giant egos who did not want to share power with the trustees. Trusts spread after 1882. In 1884, there was a cotton oil trust. We see the linseed oil trust in 1885. Linseed oil is used in paint. In 1887, we see the sugar trust, the whiskey trust, the salt trust, the cordage trust, the paving trust, school board slate trust, even an envelope trust developed in 1887. Some states tried to regulate trusts in 1889, and this led in 1890 to the Sherman Antitrust Act. By 1890, trusts began to give way to holding companies. Until recognized in law, companies had to hold tangible assets. They could not hold stock of other companies as assets. New Jersey rewrote its general incorporation law in 1889 to allow companies to hold only stocks as assets. Also, if you incorporated in New Jersey, you were also allowed to have a headquarter outside of the state. This led to a period of economic activity by merger into holding companies. There was a big surge in 1893 through 1903 that peaked in 1895 to 1899 with 92 mergers. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about already large corporations, that really does concentrate economic power and economic assets into fewer and fewer hands. The goal was to stabilize prices. Two of the most important mergers of the entire era were pulled off by J.P. Morgan's financial house. In 1893, Morgan purchased most of the railroads in the U.S., consolidating them into fewer lines that competed less with each other, gave them economies of scale, and then sold them off. And in 1901, Morgan worked with Albert Gary to buy Carnegie Steel, then merged it with Federal Steel and National Steel to create the giant corporation U.S. Steel. Let's look now at managerial capitalism. Management in big corporations was driven by a continuous process technology and by merger mania. Management was the visible hand that controlled process and business decisions. Management was broken away from owners because managers had to be professional technicians in the operations of the business. And management was by organizers rather than promoters. That is, boosters and salespeople were not the managerial class any longer. They had been earlier in the century. What manufacturing industries are we talking about here? These are the ones that were dominant between about 1870 and 1914. Steel, of course, was the most important one. And in this, Carnegie Steel was the most important driver of the steel industry. In 1872, Carnegie organized ultra-large capacity plants, and he drove those plants relentlessly. Rather than trying to conserve the physical plant, he tried to make as much steel as he possibly could. So these plants had to be replaced frequently. This allowed Carnegie to switch to open hearth furnaces easily when he replaced his Bessemer process for turning pig iron into steel. This gave him a competitive advantage, particularly over the English steel producers who were locked into their heavy capital investments into the Bessemer process and their basic mindset of preserving their physical plant. Carnegie drove his physical plant into the ground. He worked it 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, making as much steel as he could with the idea that steel making would change in the future, and then instead of just preserving his old plant, he would build new ones. This economy of scale led to steel rail costing the same as iron rail by 1883, even though it was a much more complex process, and steel rail was much better than iron rail. His management strategy was to reward effective and efficient managers, and efficiency was measured by Carnegie in controlling costs. And he controlled costs by introducing cost accounting. Cost accounting, which most businesses use today, large and small, and is kind of de rigueur in order to get loans and to operate, did not really exist before about 1875 to 1880. This system is very top-down. Carnegie Steel was very top-down. Organization came from above. U.S. Steel was the successor to Carnegie Steel as the big driver, the largest corporation, the leading edge in steel making. Competitors sought to force Carnegie into manufacturing finished product, and U.S. Steel was organized via mergers and alliances with financiers. As I've said before, J.P. Morgan and Albert Gary bought out Carnegie in 1901 when he was ready to sell. In fact, they merged U.S. Steel not only with two other big organizations, but with a conglomerate of about 200 other firms. This controlled 2/3 of the steel production in the United States and claimed to be capitalized at over $1 billion, though this claim was ultimately disputed. Another of these giant industries was the petroleum industry, and the leader here, of course, is Standard Oil of John D. Rockefeller. He built his business by underselling other petroleum manufacturers, by gaining rail rebates, including not only a rebate for shipping large quantities, but a rebate when his competitors shipped large quantities. Yes, as odd as it sounds, Rockefeller worked out a deal with most of the railroads that in order to keep his business, when his competitors shipped tank cars, he got paid for them shipping tank cars. This kind of economy of scale allowed Standard Oil price to be half of what other companies charged, and really what the manufactured good was for Standard Oil was kerosene. By 1878, Rockefeller and Standard Oil controlled 90% of U.S. refining capability. Now, his management strategy was to organize vertically like Carnegie Steel did. And vertical organization means from extraction through finished good. You control all of the steps in the process from the time the product comes out of the ground till the time it becomes a finished product. But Rockefeller also organized horizontally by forming, like we said in 1882, a trust with other refineries. By 1882, he realized he could not control or buy out all of the other refineries in the U.S. So he got together with his largest competitors to form this trust. He made himself secretary of the trust, and as everybody knows, it's not the president that controls things, it's the secretary of the business that controls everything. This trust, the Standard Oil Trust, was broken up by a lawsuit from the United States, beginning under Theodore Roosevelt and proceeding under William Howard Taft in 1911. By that time, though, trusts were way out of favor. Another of these manufacturing industries that became dominant was the electrical equipment industry. The dynamo, the electric motor, was invented in 1875. A dynamo can also produce electricity. Arc lighting, electric lighting, was invented by 1879, and the first real electric street lamp was erected in Cleveland, Ohio. Developments in the 1880s that industrialized electricity included the invention of the electric light bulb for indoor lighting. Arc lighting is entirely too hot. It's an open flame lighting in which two carbon-based electrodes are moved close enough to each other that they have an intense spark running between them. That spark not only creates light but heat, and it's actually dangerous indoors to have this kind of arc lighting. But the electric bulb, the incandescent bulb, could burn much cooler inside of a vacuum, and it could be used for interior lighting. Another one of these developments that industrialized electricity was the development of facilities for generating electricity and methods of transmitting electricity over long distances. Here, organizers replaced inventors as managers of large corporations. Two of these large corporations got into a war called the Power Wars or the Electric Wars. One of these was Edison Electric, obviously from Thomas Alva Edison. And it was a champion of direct current. Now, we don't use direct current today because Edison lost this power war. I hate to give you a spoiler, but that's what happened. Edison Electric used direct current that could only be transmitted a couple of miles from the generating plant. And ultimately, Edison Electric became General Electric. Its competitor was Westinghouse Electric, which used alternating current that had been invented by Nikola Tesla. Let me say one more thing about direct current. You still use direct current today, but in batteries. Batteries are the only thing really that we use direct current for today. Alternating current is what you use to run your regular appliances and to recharge the equipment that you're listening to this lecture over. Now, there was a fight over the installation of municipal electric systems, whether it was going to be Edison's direct current or Westinghouse's alternating current. Then these two companies went to war to try to get these municipal electric systems for large cities. There was a huge amount of money involved. Generally for lighting the streets, for lighting municipal buildings, for being able to sell electricity directly to consumers for lighting, and ultimately for other uses, and also to run streetcars and elevated trains. The big prize was Niagara Falls. Which of these companies, Edison direct current or Westinghouse alternating current, would get to use the iconic Niagara Falls to run electricity, to generate electricity, to build a powerhouse there that could be used to transmit electricity to local cities and ultimately to New York City itself? Investment bankers solicited bids, and Westinghouse, with a lead in alternating current and backed by Morgan, won in 1893, thus setting the model for future centralized power production facilities. Finally, not really the last of these dominant manufacturing industries, but certainly one that came to dominate, especially after the turn of the century, was automobiles. Automobiles were the first true consumer durable manufactured in the U.S. Between 1900 and 1915, there were over 100 car builders in the U.S. But the Ford Motor Company became the first large company after it introduced the Model T in 1908. It built the Model T until 1927. Eventually, the Ford Motor Company organized vertically. It started with steel manufacturing, worked through the production of companies, and then worked through distribution channels as well. It owned all of these things. And Henry Ford self-financed every piece of the growth of the company, thereby saddling himself without any debt. Unfortunately, that's why he kept the Model T for so long, even after sales began to drop and styles began to favor other companies like General Motors, because he refused to go into any debt to improve his physical plant. Now, this points out the automobile industry points out a number of strategies for economies of scale. One of these was mass production, like you see here in the 1913 production of the Ford Model T on the assembly line. Another economy of scale strategy was General Motors' merger strategy. So it could gather in all of these smaller companies and use their physical plant to get an economy of scale. And both of these corporations figured out that they could use an economy of scale with controlled franchised dealerships. There were ancillary industries as well. The distribution network was made possible nationwide because of the railroads, and then much later because of roads. The way this was organized was that jobbers replaced wholesale agents. Jobbers are giant wholesale corporations. They bought products, then resold them, so that manufacturers did not have to extend credit to anybody. The jobbers took care of finding credit, paying manufacturers. The jobbers tended to use local credit as well. In distribution, we see the development of something relatively new under the sun in the 1870s, the department store, as we understand it today. The first of these was made by John Wanamaker of Philadelphia, whose real trademark was not only to bring in all of these various, for lack of a better phrase, little stores under his single roof, and call them each departments, but also to trade in honesty. That is, his guarantee was writ in law almost. He honored any guarantee that he made for customer satisfaction. And this concept helped to sell the department store, which quite frankly had a lot of resistance. It met a lot of resistance, just like a Walmart meets resistance from local businesses today. Some of these stores were owned by jobbers as a way of vertically organizing. Marshall Fields of Chicago is one of the jobbers that owned a famous department store in downtown. Another of these distribution industries was the mail order industry. Merchants like Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward. Montgomery Ward was a single guy. J.C. Penney. They bought from manufacturers and sold via mail order catalogs. The spread of railroads, and after 1896, rural free delivery by the U.S. Post Office made this possible. Not only could catalogs get out to the people, particularly in the country, half of the country lived outside of urban areas even up to 1920. 1920 is the first census that records a 50-50 split between rural and urban America. So rural free delivery and railroads made mail order possible. Let me make an aside here to say that I lived in a house that had been mail ordered from Sears and Roebuck. It was called a Craftsman House in Portland, Oregon for a while. This house was built in 1926, and it was brought in on the railroad, cost probably about $1,500 to build. It was brought in as a kit on the railroad and then assembled on site. Another one of these ancillary industries that's vitally important to the growth of big business and big manufacturing during the Gilded Age is the finance industry, that is, investment banking. The finance industry's job was to accumulate capital to put into industry. One of the mechanisms was investment banking. These were a new financial mechanism that worked closely with big industrialists to create trusts and holding companies. We see the growth of capital markets, that is, the stock markets that grew in the unregulated atmosphere of the Gilded Age. Schemes such as watered stock, that is, issues that were significantly larger than assets would allow in the event of bankruptcy, were common, and they brought the financial industry and the stock markets into disdain. We see also that speculation was rampant, as was charlatanism. Speculation is what we might call today, one aspect of speculation that we hold in great disdain today is selling short, betting that the stock market will go down rather than up, selling quickly after buying stocks. Day trading is a form of speculation. You buy low, you sell high, and while within reason that's a great way to make a profit, when you do that unreasonably and do it in mass numbers, it can tend to knock the underpinnings out from under the market and grossly overinflate the assets of any market. We've seen that in bubbles in the last 20 years as well. But other financiers, which were not completely savory, stopped the unraveling of the economy in many cases. The House of Morgan, for example, organized railroad industries after 1893 by buying and consolidating the failing routes that we've already talked about. Morgan consolidated the steel industry after 1901. And in 1907, Morgan loaned enough gold bullion to the United States government to prop up the U.S. economy during a sharp downturn. Well, this is the end of the lecture. It goes with the next lecture, so I hope you won't have a great deal of time lapse between the end of this one and the beginning of your next one. As always, thank you for your time.